Regina Young, as Colin was saying. My partner John Davis and I practice in the labor and employment field at our law firm. And so I was contacted by Chris a few months ago, and he asked if I would do this presentation about appropriate or inappropriate questions to ask at a job interview. So before I get started, I'm just trying to get an idea of how many folks we have here who hire applicants for jobs, okay? Is that maybe about half of you all? And I assume that you all interview applicants as part of the hiring process, is that right? Do you all use paper applications as well, where they fill out an application? Okay, well, very good. So we're going to talk to you a little bit today about what are appropriate questions and inappropriate questions to ask at job interviews. So we're tasked here, the challenge is to keep everybody engaged and awake now that you've all eaten lunch. So hopefully we'll be able to do that. And we'd like audience participation. So we handed out these handouts with a list of the questions that we're going to cover today. Before we get into those questions, I assume everybody here knows about Title VII, American Disabilities Act, and other discrimination laws, and that it's unlawful to discriminate against employees or current employees, right? We all understand that. So what we're not going to do today is go into any detail about the specifics of those acts. But we also want to make sure that everyone is aware that those acts also apply in the application process, right? Does everyone understand that? So you can't discriminate against applicants before they're hired. So that's what we're going to work on today. So John's going to help me with this. So let's start with question one. Does everyone have a handout? Okay, so how old are you? If you think that's an appropriate interview question to ask someone who's applying for a job, raise your hand. So I think I have one hand raised. What about, are you at least 18 years of age? Is that appropriate or inappropriate by show of hands? What is your date of birth? Appropriate or inappropriate? So I think most of you all are aware at least of age discrimination and why the first and the third questions would be inappropriate. So under the age discrimination laws, it's acceptable other than are you 16, 18 years or older, of course for child labor laws, that no questions would be acceptable. It's prohibited any question designed to discover someone's age. And you know, I understand that you all are from smaller counties, and so you probably recognize a lot of job applicants, right? Maybe you think someone went to high school with your brother or sister, or you know, even a parent, and just you're chit-chatting, and it might seem natural as the conversation is flowing. Hey, when did you graduate high school? Does everyone understand why that would be an inappropriate question? Why that would be an inappropriate question? Okay. Any questions about that?
Just on the age, can you hear me on this one? Can you hear in the back at all? Okay, good. You know, so the Age Discrimination Act covers people who are 40 years of age and older. And you know, some people think that there's a retirement age, and that if someone is older like I am, that you wouldn't want to hire me to work on the road crew, possibly. But that's against the law. No questions asked. There is no retirement age in the United States anymore. It used to be 65, and they raised it to 70. But unless you're a commercial pilot flying for Delta or an air traffic controller, they also have a mandatory retirement age. There is no retirement age. So you could have an applicant for, let's say, a truck driver, a dump truck driver who is 85 years old. If they have a CDL and a medical card, you cannot discriminate against them because of their age, or talk about their age during the interview, or ask them any questions about what we'll get to later on, but just, so be very careful about using someone's advanced age to, in your decision whether to hire them or not.
You might also want to check your paper applications to make sure you don't have a question asking for date of birth.
Yeah, or when did you graduate from high school? Might be, I've seen that on applications, something like that.
I anticipate that it's a lot less likely that someone would stumble upon and ask that inappropriate question in a job interview, but it might be in an old job application that hasn't been reviewed in a while. So we'd recommend that you check out your job application.
Most of the people that come in my experience, they've already bought a resume that has all that on there, or a good portion of it on there.
Yeah, I know, and that's, she actually said a lot of times people will have already submitted a resume that might have, I graduated from high school in 1966 or something. You know, you can't undo that, unfortunately, but, so that's, they shouldn't be doing that, but some of them still do.
Okay, moving on. Question number 4. How many of you think that it's appropriate to ask a job applicant if they've ever been treated for alcoholism? Does anybody think that's appropriate? What about asking a job applicant, have you ever been addicted to drugs? Would that be an appropriate question to ask? What about, have you ever been convicted of drunk driving? Maybe? Yeah.
Especially if there's going to be a driving for the road department or driving kind of vehicle of any kind, maybe.
Right, and I would agree. So I think that the group is correct. The first two, absolutely inappropriate. Alcoholism, drug addiction, it can be a disability. It's a disability under the ADA, so you don't want to ask about that. But if the job is to drive a truck, you certainly want to know if they've been convicted of drunk driving in the past. So again, just to cover what we've already talked about. Nobody anymore?
I think the two microphones being so close together, they're affecting one another.
So again, acceptable, specific job-related inquiries, such as whether the applicant has been convicted for drunk driving or uses illegal drugs. Any prohibited inquiries would be any inquiry about how much the applicant drinks or whether the applicant has participated in an alcohol rehabilitation program, because alcoholism is a covered disability under the ADA.
Yeah, and you have to understand, alcoholism, as she said, is covered under the ADA. Illegal drug use is not. So you have to be careful. Especially in a smaller, I lived a long time in Jefferson County, so I know a little about smaller counties. And a lot of times you may know an applicant or have heard about an applicant. You know, well, I understand that, you know, I've always heard that they were an alcoholic. But even if they're not an alcoholic and you don't hire them because of that, you regarded them as being disabled, so you violated the law. So you may have pressure from someone who you are hiring for, a department you're hiring for, not to consider that person because I know that they drink a lot, I know they're an alcoholic. And like it or not, that's a protected class, and you cannot in any way take that into consideration when you're going through the hiring process, so be careful.
Number 7, have you ever been convicted of a felony? Well, I see a lot of
Specifically asking, not the arrested, but what type, the specific.
Right, if you've been convicted of a felony, and the operative word there is convicted. And the next question, have you ever been arrested? Right, we all understand that would be inappropriate. But to ask about conviction would be appropriate. Number 9, in the last 2 years, have you ever been convicted of a misdemeanor that resulted in imprisonment? And again, that would be a conviction, and that would be an appropriate question. So, getting to our slide here, arrest records are never appropriate to ask about. And it's prohibited, any inquiry relating to arrest, you're presumed innocent until proven guilty. Criminal records of arrest without conviction are not useful and may be prejudicial. They're going to get tougher. Question number 10, does your religion prevent you from working on weekends? How many of you all think that's an appropriate question? Okay, we're getting lots of shakes. Can you work on weekends? Appropriate or inappropriate? Appropriate. So we're going to have another slide later on about religious discrimination, but availability for work and religious discrimination is kind of where this area is focused. So it's acceptable to ask if an applicant can meet the work schedule. You just have to be cautious of answers that reveal an applicant's religious observances and whether that makes him or her unavailable for weekend shifts. So any questions about religious preference, affiliation, observance, or practices are not appropriate.
One thing too, if you only ask, let's say, females, so tell me how you're going to arrange for childcare for your children. That would be gender discrimination, correct? So what happens in these interviews, they're not, they start out structured, then, the questions come and you may get put on the spot, but just try to be very careful what you say, but everything should be neutral. If you're going to ask a question of a female applicant, you need to ask it also the male applicants.
Question 12. Now that I've described the essential duties of the job, are you able to perform them as described? You guys are good at this.
Yeah.
That would be an appropriate question. What about, do you have any pre-existing health conditions? No. What about, how would you describe your general physical health? Is that a closer call? Do we still think that's inappropriate? You guys are good. Okay. When was the last date of your physical exam? Does anyone think that that might be appropriate? Okay. Are you willing to take a physical exam if the nature of the job for which you are applying requires one? And what about 17? Are you on any medication? Who thinks that's appropriate? Well, you all got all those right. So what is this? Disability discrimination, right? That's what all of these questions are related to. So whether an applicant has the ability to perform specific job functions, asking an applicant to describe or demonstrate how he or she would perform job tasks, whether the applicant will require reasonable accommodation only when the applicant has an obvious disability or when the applicant voluntarily discloses that he or she has a disability. So those would all be acceptable types of questions to ask. Inquiries likely to elicit information about a disability, general inquiries such as, do you have any medical problems which might reveal disabilities not related to ability to perform a specific job. Any types of questions along that line would be prohibited. Have you ever worked for the county under a different name? Y'all think that would be appropriate? I think so too. Are you married?
No.
Not appropriate. Please provide the name, address, and phone number of a nearby relative we should contact in case of emergency. Well, check out 21. Please provide the name, address, and phone number of someone we should contact in case of emergency.
That would be better.
And my guess is, on forms, you may or may not be asking this on the application, but I would check it in case you are, make sure instead of relative, that you just put someone in there. Does that make sense? You see why that would be a little bit better than asking about a relative?
Why would you be asking about this on an application anyway?
Well, I mean, I understand, someone it might be on an application. Is your spouse currently employed with the county? Again, it's just, I would say that would not be appropriate, because, I mean, it's just another way of finding out if someone is married. What about, when you ask a female, do you prefer to be called Miss, Mrs., or Miss? Would that be appropriate to ask in the job interview? Okay. I would say inappropriate, right, because it's going to indicate the marital status. So it's just not acceptable to inquire about marital status of applicants. Whether an applicant is married, single, divorced, separated, engaged, widow, it really has no bearing.
We got to put on that, if your spouse works for the county, why do you have a nepotism policy?
Well, we talked about that.
Yeah. I don't, do many of you have nepotism policies? Okay, yes, I mean, that would be a valid question to ask. And I don't know how deep those nepotism policies go, you know, if it's just a spouse or if it's a brother or sister or something. That would be an issue. Let me go back to disability for a minute. Because I think that's probably where I would say more of the issues are going to come up. The workforce is aging. People are, I'm seeing more disability claims. You know, people have conditions that make it more difficult for them to do certain types of jobs. And you've got some jobs in the county, I know, that are pretty physically demanding a lot of times. And so we talk about, in labor law, and some of you all, most of you know this probably, there are really three phases of the application process. You have the applicant first, the pre-employment phase. Then you have the post-offer, you have the applicant phase. Then you have the pre-employment, or post-offer pre-employment phase. So I've interviewed you, and I've selected you for the job. I've offered you the job contingent upon a few things, maybe a drug test or background check, something else. So now you have the job if all that comes back the way it should. So now we're in the post-offer pre-employment. During that phase, you can ask disability-related questions. You can require someone to take a physical examination. You can require them to fill out a medical questionnaire. It's wide open at that point. You can ask them you can ask them anything you want. Are you an alcoholic? Are you, so my question to you is, do you want to know a lot of those things? You know, because chances are you won't be able to use them to change your decision to offer them the job, okay? So I know that's a little bit off the subject because we're talking about interviewing, but I don't know what you do in the post-offer pre-employment phase. If a lot of you do, many of you do medical examinations, those things are kind of, some of you do. Some people use medical questionnaires where they go down, have you ever had a back injury? Have you ever had any trouble with your whatever, you know? And then when you get that information back and process it, if there is something on there that concerns you, then that opens up a whole new set of rules under the Americans with Disabilities Act on trying to accommodate them and so forth. But if you go online, the EEOC has a pretty good, short, it's only 9 pages long, paper on the application process. And you can just Google EEOC application process, Americans with Disabilities Act. And it has some pretty good examples
One of them I wanted to share with you just for a minute, because it does have to do with someone who comes into your office to apply for a job. This says, if the employer knows that an applicant has a disability, and it is reasonable to question whether the disability might pose difficulties for the individual in performing a certain job task, then the employer may ask whether she would need a reasonable accommodation to perform the task. So this is an obvious disability, or maybe they've told you that they have a condition. Here's the example they give. Carl has a severe limp and uses a cane because of his prosthetic leg. He applies for an assembly line job which does not require employees to move around, but does require that they stand for long periods of time. The employer asks Carl about his ability to stand and whether he will need reasonable accommodation to perform the job. Carl replies that he will need an accommodation. The employer asks for examples. Carl suggests two possibilities: a tall stool so that he can sit down, or alternatively, a sit-stand chair which will provide support and enable him to do the job. So this could all happen during the job application. Someone comes in, you have doubts because of a disability they tell you about, or that is very obvious, whether they can do the job. And so you may end up in a discussion about that, which is perfectly fine at that point. If it's obvious, what you can't do is try to elicit information from them that would cause them to disclose a disability. Like the question that Regina asked, are you on any medication? Because if they said yes, I'm on this certain type, then you could figure out probably pretty quickly what their condition was. So.
Moving on to military status. Question 24, was your military discharge honorable or dishonorable? That would be inappropriate, right? We all know that. An appropriate question about military status would be what educational or job experience have you acquired during your military service would be useful on the job for which you are applying. So again, acceptable inquiries about education, training, work experience gained in the U.S. Armed Forces as it relates to the particular job. And right, that's the purpose of the job interview, right? I mean, you're trying to find out who is the most qualified and capable applicant for that job. Kind of seems like common sense. You want to ask questions that relate to that specific job. Current status in the military, for example, National Guard or Army Reserve, type or condition of military discharge would not be appropriate.
You know, I get questions a lot, and you probably do too, Regina. Employers call and they say, we've been looking for someone qualified, we have found someone, and they have told us that they're in the National Guard. And they're gonna have to take 2 weeks off, maybe more, and we need somebody now. The answer to that question is pretty easy. It doesn't matter. You cannot refuse to give them the job because they've told you that, any more than you can refuse to give a woman a job because she's told you she's pregnant and going to deliver in 3 weeks. So as far as the military status is concerned, past, present, future, even if they say, I'm thinking about joining the National Guard, or I'm thinking about joining the reserves, you cannot discriminate against them or use that in the hiring process.
26, how long has your family been in the United States? Appropriate. Where were you born? Are you a U.S. citizen? Okay. We'll talk about that in a minute, but it seems like I got a lot of responses that was an appropriate question to ask. Okay, we'll come back. What language do you commonly speak in your household? Not appropriate. Number 30, if you are offered and accept a job, can you submit proof of your legal right to work in the United States? Okay. Are you a U.S. citizen? Not acceptable.
Yes, sir.
If I apply for my purchase of
that gun dealer is not covered by the employment laws. So I'm sure that that's acceptable. What?
Government employee.
Right, yeah, and that's, as far as I know, that's fine, but as for an employer to ask of an employee, as Regina has on here, the question to ask is number 30. Right.
I'm sorry?
Okay. But as I said, really it's number 30 is the one you want to ask. Now in some, in some government contractors, they end up in the post-offer stage asking about that. If someone needs a security clearance, it can only be given to someone who's a U.S. citizen. Otherwise, if they can fill out the I-9 and give you the information that they need for the I-9 that appears to you to be authentic, then they qualify.
I have a question. Okay,
Yes.
so like county clerks, to work in voter registration, to register someone to vote, you have to be a registered voter. So why would you not ask that question?
Ask if someone's a registered voter?
No, it's a U.S. citizen.
Yeah.
To be a registered voter, you're supposed to be a U.S. citizen. And to work in our office and register someone to vote, you have to be registered to vote yourself.
Okay, well, that may be an exception then. But you might have to accommodate that. I don't know how many people you need in your office to register people to vote.
Everybody in our office does.
But is that necessary, that everybody be
We
available
only
to
got
do it?
several people, people on vacation, people on lunch, whoever's on duty needs to be able to do that.
Okay, then that may be an exception that you could use. That's unusual, though, I would say. Well, I'm glad you brought that up. That's interesting. Then I guess everybody, then that's the county clerk's office that does that.
We also take it a step further and ask them if they have an issue with becoming a registered voter,
If they are not,
if they're not.
because they
Which
just
kind of
want
gets
to.
into the religious aspect at times, I would
It could.
assume, but,
It sure
you know,
could.
we do ask that question and we go into why we're asking that question.
Okay, and why are you asking the question? I think I know, but
Again, they need to be a registered voter themselves in order to be a state registered.
is that state law or is that just your policy?
I think it's state law.
You need to check that and make sure. I know Mike Rainwater can check that and see if that's, or Colin can check it. If it's not state law, if it's just your own policy, then that won't work. But if it's state law, then that's probably an exception.
Okay, so inquiries into an applicant's ability to read, write, speak English, foreign languages when required for a specific job, that would be okay. Individuals must be able to communicate well enough to perform the job. Inquiries about whether applicant is legally eligible to work in the United States, all acceptable. I guess with the exception of what we were just talking about, inquiries about an applicant's lineage, ancestry, national origin, descent, place of birth, mother tongue, national origin of applicant's parents or spouse. Those types of questions are prohibited. Refusal to hire because of a foreign accent could be construed as national origin discrimination. Okay, I think we've already covered this earlier. This is pretty easy. Do you anticipate having a child within the next few years? Are you pregnant? I mean, just don't ever ask a woman that. But especially not in a job interview. Do you have any responsibilities that conflict with the job attendance and/or travel requirements? I think those would be appropriate, right? As long as you're asking it of everybody, you're not just asking only the female applicants, right? If you have children, what provisions have you made for childcare? That would also be inappropriate. So there are no acceptable inquiries regarding pregnancy. Any question related to pregnancy or medical history concerning pregnancy, inquiries that might elicit answers based on pregnancy or family planning status prohibited, and that's tricky because we all talk about our kids, right? I mean, it's just, that's what we do, and I'm certain that it comes up in job interviews, so you just have to be careful. I mean, even if you don't ask those types of questions, they are providing that information to you, so just be very, very, very careful with those kinds of landmines. Of course, what is your racial background? Inappropriate. There are no acceptable questions about race or color. What about 36? You look familiar. Are you a member of the Methodist Church? Right, inappropriate. What about if you're interviewing the month of December? What are your holiday plans this year? Again, it's just casual, you're hitting it off with whoever you're interviewing, it seems okay. You're just being friendly. Probably something you should stay away from.
What happens if this is a reversal and the applicant is asking, how do you feel about that to the interviewer?
I would dodge the question. I've got a lot of questions to ask you about the job here. Let's move on. I don't know, however you can, get out of the situation. I would.
What was our question?
What if the roles were reversed? I think that's mine, because I had not had a child at that time. And so in the interview, I just casually asked, I said, what is your feelings about, hiring me if I end up getting pregnant?
Oh, okay. I thought you were talking about holiday plans, but you
Well,
asked
I
that
did that
question.
too. I did that too because all my family was in Texas. I reversed it. And so I did it to the employer.
So if you have a problem applicant like her, as Regina says, I think you just have to be kind, because they're not thinking employment laws. You just have to say, well, you've got to be very careful about
Yeah.
what we talk about during this phase, and so let me get back on track so I don't get off. Don't get sued. Don't get sued. But you bring up a really good point. Like I said earlier, they start out structured, and then you may morph into talking about a lot of they may be uncomfortable, and they want to ask questions to make maybe you feel more comfortable about them, and so you just have some of it you can't avoid. You just do the best you can, but then be very careful. Now back to your question, you asked, how would you feel about hiring me if I told you that I plan to have a family?
Right.
And I mean, you would absolutely say, you have to respond to that.
Yeah.
And say that has absolutely nothing to do with the decision that we'll make. Okay.
And I've not run into a person ever, I've represented or otherwise, who hires people. It's part of what they do, who set out to intentionally discriminate. And so I think what you have to be careful of is probably someone, you accidentally stumbling on a question where you certainly didn't mean to get any information about someone's religion or their national origin or whether they intend to have kids. But it happens, or that person brings it up, and then that person doesn't get hired. And it wasn't that you didn't hire them because of that, but they are thinking back about how overqualified they were, the perfect applicant, and they start thinking about what happened at that interview. And you know what? She asked me about my kids, or if I plan to have any, or just something, or did I go to high school with her parents, or something, and that's where you get in trouble. So there's no doubt in my mind that nobody intends to discriminate or is looking for this information because you don't want to hire somebody. But that's what we're trying to help you all avoid, is where someone doesn't get hired and the only reason they can think of, because they were the absolute most perfect job applicant, was that the information they provided you about what their religion is. Does that make sense? Question 38, what is your gender? We all know you don't ask that. 39, have you ever been injured on the job?
No.
What about, have you ever filed for workers' compensation?
Yes.
Okay, does anyone think that's appropriate? I'll let John.
But not at that stage, but at the next stage, at the post-offer pre-employment stage, you could do that. But let me say one more thing on the job app, when you're interviewing someone, some of you might take notes on either the job application or separately from that. And understand that those are not confidential. If there's a lawsuit, those will have to be produced. And if you send an email to the director of the department or someone that you're interviewing for with anything, saying anything that, they seem like a good applicant, maybe a little too old for the job, maybe, or to learn the stuff, all of that is discoverable. The only way it's not is if it's a communication with your attorney. So just be mindful of that when you're sending emails or you're sending texts to people. If you need to discuss something that you're a little uncomfortable about, I'm not saying you're going to violate the law, but you don't really know how to put it in an email and you shouldn't, just send a 2-word email that says, call me.
Maybe if you're interviewing 20 or 30 applicants and you're having a hard time keeping up with somebody, and you might be inclined to, make some shorthand regarding what their physical appearance is. Not because it matters, but it's just to help you remember who that person was. Again, like John was saying, those notes would be discoverable in the event there's litigation about not hiring. And I can tell you what everyone is going to focus in on is the fact that you wrote down the person's race, gray hair, any kind of physical description that's going to be zeroed in on. So I would discourage any types of notes along that line.
Yeah.
Early on, I had a case, and I won't go into detail, but this was a bottling company that delivered, this is back when you remember the wooden crates that they would put the bottles in. And the note on the application was, he's too old for the job. So that made the defense of the case very difficult, and the case settled. But that was just written on the application, thrown into the mix. So again, be careful what you write down.
As I was preparing, I saw something, I didn't include it as part of the presentation, but I was reading some literature that discouraged employers from asking for photographs, a photograph of a job applicant, and it was clear for that reason. So I don't know if anyone does that, request photographs, but I would encourage you to stop that if you did. Okay. I think that concludes all of the different categories that I had covered in the presentation. I've got some questions here at the end, just regarding different areas. Question 41, what is your height and weight? Anyone think that would be an appropriate question? I agree that would be an inappropriate question. What about question number 46, do you work out regularly? And this has to do with ADA and disability laws. So if physical condition is a requirement for employment, business necessity must be documented. So if you're going to ask any of those types of questions, you need to have that documented in the job description. Any physical exams must occur after an offer of employment is made, as we were talking about earlier. Question number 42, do you own or rent your residence?
No.
Again, that would be inappropriate. That could have an adverse impact on minorities or people who are from a different country who are legal to work but who aren't U.S. citizens. What are your hobbies? Who all asked about hobbies in job interviews? We've got one person in the back. You've asked. And it is a lot of people included on a resume. I would suggest that you not ask about just hobbies in general. And why? Because it may hint at someone's age, gender, their race, religion. Again, you're hitting it off, you're just trying to get to know somebody, and you ask that question. It seems innocent enough. But that may be, something that leads to a discussion that it'd be better off not talking about in a job interview. So if you want to ask about organizations, question number 44, what organizations do you belong to that relate to the job for which you are applying? Right. What is your political affiliation? Do you have any questions? We finished a little early.
So we haven't talked about social media and hiring employees, have we? Okay, we're not going to. So. That's really out there. I mean, everybody close your eyes, and I'll ask this question. I want you to raise your hand. I don't want you to see anybody else who does this. How many of you Google your applicants before you hire them? Just about everybody. Okay. I don't know what you find out. You go on social media. A lot of times you don't want to know. Because later on you want to be able to answer honestly. I didn't know that they did this, because that's when I was talking about the post-offer pre-employment time. So let's say you give a medical questionnaire. These people are, they're qualified for the job. You're ready to hire them. You've offered them a job. You give them the medical questionnaire, and you find out that they are HIV positive, okay? And you don't hire them. You lose on that. There's probably not a job that in the county that someone can't be HIV positive and have. Someone may force you and they say, well, we can't hire that person. Or let's say you learn something later on about them, or you hire them and then pretty quickly you determine that they're not the person for the job and you let them go. And they say, well, the real reason you let me go is because you knew I was HIV positive. So you hired me, made up all these things about me, and fired me. So now it's based on something that you couldn't do anything about anyway, that you have knowledge about. Same thing goes for social media. You can find out so much on there, whether it's true or not. And so you just have to be very careful. That doesn't help you to say you have to be very careful. But how deep you want to go into some of that. Because you may find out stuff you can't use, but that you now are charged with knowing, right?
I was told, and I don't want to get into a discussion about medical marijuana because I'm not.
Oh, no.
I know, I told you I wouldn't, but I was told we were going to get some questions. Is it appropriate to ask an applicant if they have a prescription for medical marijuana? No.
You don't ask them about any other prescriptions, so you don't.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, because, the medical, if they have a prescription for that means that they have a condition, and almost any condition is covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act. So now you've asked them about do they have a disability, basically. I don't know what position, if any, the county has taken, the group has taken on medical marijuana, safety-sensitive positions, and all those things in the act and in the amendment that that you'll be dealing with pretty soon. Because you have a lot of safety-sensitive positions. I think Mike was talking to Mike Rainwater before the meeting. You're going to go over some new guidelines, I think, that talk about safety-sensitive positions. And I would encourage you to get a copy, if you don't already have one, of the amendment to the Constitution and the act that amended the amendment. It's not a lot, but the amendment that the legislature passed basically is all employment-related. It talks about what you can do to people if they have a safety-sensitive position, if they're a current user of medical marijuana. But it's going to be kind of a rough road for a while, I think. Whenever people start coming to you with these cards that say that they, can use marijuana. So you promised you wouldn't bring it up, but you did. But
I knew you could cover it.
no, I didn't cover it, but I know that the county, they'll be giving you this group will be giving you some guidance on that, and Mike will be giving, his group will be giving you some guidance on that too. But there's just not a lot out there, on exactly what you can do. Because you have a federal law that says it's against the law, you have a state law that says it's not.